Okay, here we are back from our break. I want to play a little bit of catch-up here. I want to mention a couple of books. Here is a brand new book, A History of Christian Missions, which of course only has about 3 pages on Scandinavia in the whole thing because it starts from the very beginning and goes up to 1914. But it is a new book, and so it's sort of cutting edge if you're interested in the subject of missions and missionaries. Another one that I picked up, an older book, that is very extensive and goes into enormous depth here, is the English missionaries in Sweden and Finland. And this goes into, if you really want to dig into the absolute nitty-gritty, all the little details of everything that's known and all the arguments for and against, you know, whether this fact is true or not, this is the book. And it's a very good one. I mean, if you're interested in those English missionaries, especially to compare them to some of the earlier missionaries on the continent. So this is an older book, but very good. I also wanted to mention, before we get into the kings and kingship, I was telling you how different the cathedrals were in Scandinavia from France and England. So I wanted to show you just a couple of pictures from France and England so you can see the kind of cathedrals there. And I've picked out some of them. Maybe some you can see better than others. Here is an interior of, you see the pointed arches, and you can see how much taller the nave is, and pointed arches of the Gothic, the French Gothic style. Here it would be an exterior, which looks really, really different. Doesn't this look different from all the Scandinavian churches? This would be like cutting-edge French architecture. In France. This is Romanesque right here, which is, and with the wall paintings. You see, this is the old-fashioned, this is the old part of the church that was the architecture on the continent at the time the Vikings converted, and they just stuck with that. They didn't change it. And while France was forging ahead with other kinds of architecture, with the development of sculpture, you see nothing like that in Scandinavia. And here again is the wedding cake type of church, St. Julian of Le Mans. Here is Normandy, the town of Lisieux, with the big cathedral in the front. And here would be an interior. This is Norman Romanesque, but even this is really, really different than you see in Scandinavia. So that's an idea of what was being done in France, and I can give you a real quick idea of what was being done in England. Here are some of the English ones. Here is the Abbey of Bath. Again, very different from anything in Scandinavia. Here is Wells Cathedral in the front. Utterly different from what was done in Scandinavia. This is Gloucester in England, which is Norman Romanesque. This would have been done by the Anglo-Normans after William the Conqueror. Remember I said that William the Conqueror tore down all the Anglo-Saxon things and built Norman churches. In every little town and every city in England, there's one of those Norman Romanesque interiors. Here's another one that looks very similar. And so you can see how really different the Scandinavian churches are, and they're sort of archaic. You almost might call them archaic. So I brought these pictures to show you a little bit of what we can compare them to. Now let's turn to looking at the Scandinavian lists of kings, and we don't have a lot of information about what these kings did. We know a little bit about them, their activities in conversion, their activities in trying to conquer a lot of people. We do have king lists and dynasty lists, and this is the list for Denmark called the Jelling dynasty. The first one that we can identify, and the bold-faced ones are the kings, Gorm the Old, then we have Harold Bluetooth and Svein Forkbeard, who we just mentioned quite a bit. Harold II was not a king of Denmark, but then Canute the Great, who was also king of England, and his son Harthacnut, who was king in Denmark for quite a long time. Then we can trace the dynasty down through Magnus the Good, who was also king of Norway, and then we have a new dynasty of Svein Estrithson, Estrith being a woman, and so this dynasty is all traced down from Estrith. Anybody remember who Estrith was? She was Canute's sister. Okay, so the dynasty then of Svein Estrithson is all descended from Canute's sister. And then we have Harold III, Canute the Holy, Olaf Hunger, and Eric Evergood. And so this then is the foundation of the dynasty in Denmark. The kings of Denmark emerged as the most powerful force in Scandinavia as chieftains gave way to states. Overlordship over southern Sweden and as far north of Vestfold in Norway was their great achievement, unifying southern Sweden and part of Norway as well as Denmark. And according to the Danish kingship, any member of the royal family could inherit the kingship, and succession disputes were common. The unsuccessful claimants would go into exile, or they would become Vikings. Like, can you think of one of these guys who left and became a Viking? How about Eric Bloodaxe? Remember, he was thrown out of Norway, and he went to Scotland, and he was Viking and conquered a kingdom in Scotland and northern England. And so this is what they did when they couldn't be king. They went out and conquered a kingdom someplace else. They would also, if they had a Viking career and they would bring home a lot of wealth, the wealth would allow them to make a fresh bid for the throne. But the authority of the kings of Denmark collapsed from the 950s to 1000, and that was when Harald Finehair took over Norway. It was Gorm the Old who revived the Danish power, and he's really looked at as the first of these Danish kings. His son, Harold Bluetooth, reestablished Danish control over Norway. Harold himself was baptized in 965, and he was the first Scandinavian king to promote Christianity. His son, Svein Forkbeard, increased the wealth and authority of the Danish kingdom by raiding England and also by leading raids himself and preventing other Vikings from getting enough wealth to challenge his power. His comrade in arms was Olaf Tryggvason in England, and his sister Theri, Svein's sister Theri, married Olaf Tryggvason. His daughter Gyda married Earl or Jarl Erik Kakanarsson, but Olaf Tryggvason temporarily established himself as king of Norway. He died in the Battle of Svold in 1000, fighting Svein Forkbeard. So all of the kings, whether they're all connected to each other, and they're connected by marriage. That's why it's so hard to follow the royal line and figure out what happened. The kings had military camps at Trelleborg, Firkat, Agersborg, and Odense, and there was an extortion of the Danegeld from England that made them enormously wealthy. They attacked England, and Svein Forkbeard was accepted as a full king in England, and Canute the Great succeeded, and we've already looked at the reign of Canute the Great in England. So that's a little thumbnail sketch of the kings of Denmark. Now turning to Norway, and notice how late these kingdoms start. The first king was Gorm the Old, and he was very late in the Danish history that you could identify real kings who were taking control of the kingdom. The same is true of Norway. The first one we can identify is Harald Finehair. Then Eric Bloodaxe took over, but he was deposed. And this is what would happen if you weren't a Christian king and you didn't have God on your side. You could be deposed and voted out by your followers or by the jarls. And so this is what happened to Eric Bloodaxe, and he then went to England and conquered York and became a king of York. Then Hakon the Good took over, and he was a Christian, and he of course was thrown out. Or he was forced to become a pagan, to give up his Christianity and become a pagan when he couldn't convert his people. Harold Greycloak was king for a while after Hakon the Good, and then finally Olaf Tryggvason helped to build the kingship, and Olaf the Stout Haraldsson, or Olaf the Fat, became Saint Olaf. And here is the remaining dynasty of Norway. Harald Finehair established the Norwegian kingdom by driving out the Danes. Question?
Harold Finehair and Harold Fairhair are the same person.
They're
correct?
the same person. Good. Okay. Sometimes I call him Finehair, and sometimes I call him. Am I doing that?
No, but on your lecture before intermission, you were calling him Fairhair.
Oh, okay. They're the same person. The same person. Yeah. You can see the similarity between Finehair and Fairhair. It's the same thing. Well, Harald Finehair established the Norwegian kingdom by driving out the Danes, but the control of the Jarls of Hladir and Trondelag remained weak. When Canut's chief aide, Eric, Earl of Hladir, was in England helping Canute, Olaf Haraldsson the Stout, or who became Saint Olaf, defeated the pro-Danish forces in Norway and made himself king. So one of the things about Canute's conquest of England was it made his other lands in Denmark and Norway vulnerable. Olaf then allied himself with the Swedes and invaded Skane in 1026, but Canute came back from England. He took a fleet of 50 ships and invaded Norway against Olaf the Fat. The stepson of Sigurd Sao, half-brother of Harald Hardrade, was a Viking in many lands and water. He fought in England under Thorkel the Tall and was baptized Olavus Rex Noricum at Rouen in Normandy. And this is Saint Olaf who was baptized, essentially Olaf, king of the Norsemen, at Rouen in Normandy by Duke Richard. I think it was Duke Richard II who baptized him as king. Olaf the Stout then returned to England to fight for Ethelred the Unready and invaded Norway with ships and dispossessed Earl or Jarl Hakon Eriksson. He acquired most of the Norwegian realm and also acquired a reputation as a peacemaker and a lawgiver. Olaf the Fat undertook the conversion of Norway and established a strong church there, but he clashed with Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden and then married his daughter Astrid. Again, another of those marriage alliances that solidified everyone's power. Olaf the Fat then made an anti-Danish alliance with Olaf Skotkonung and Anand Jacob of Sweden, both of Sweden, but his power was eroded by Canute and his own countrymen, because remember, Canute had this claim to Norway at the same time because the kings of Denmark had ruled Norway for a long time. Olaf's hardline imposition of Christianity made him very unpopular, so he finally had to flee to Sweden and finally flee to Russia. But he returned after the drowning of Jarl Hakon Eriksson. He was killed then at the great battle of Stiklestad, where all of these people came together and had a huge battle. Olaf the Fat was killed at that point, and then he became, interestingly, Saint Olaf. And this is very important because he was regarded as a martyr for Christianity, because He was trying to bring Christianity to Norway, and he was fighting so hard to be a Christian king that the church adopted him as a saint, and he is virtually the first the first Scandinavian saint at all. And all of a sudden then, since conversion is really rolling ahead, churches dedicated to St. Olaf pop up all over Scandinavia. Now, once they have their very own Scandinavian saint, it just sort of injects new energy into the conversion. And this also helps the conversion because they have their own saint, and legends develop after his death. Canute appointed his own English concubine or wife. I argued in the last lecture that Alfkefu was actually his wife, and I still say she was, as a regent of Norway, but she was unpopular and Canute's grip began to slip. Canute was the greatest of the Viking kings, but his empire fell apart when he died in 1035, and Harthacnut was accepted as king of Denmark, but the English chose Harthacnut's brother, Harald Harefoot. Meanwhile, the Norwegians crowned Magnus the Good, who was son of St. Olaf, or Olaf the Fat, and Harald Hardrada, then half-brother of Olaf Haraldsson, or St. Olaf, fled first to Sweden and then to Russia, became a mercenary for Prince Yaroslav the Wise of Novgorod, and in 1033 became one of the Byzantine Varangian guards at Constantinople. And Harald Hardrada is a fascinating person, and one reason we know so much about him is because there was a saga written about him, and so we can trace a lot of his story. Also, you know, he's getting into the historical period where we know more about him. For 9 years, as one of the Varangian guards at Constantinople, he won golden fame, and in his saga he sails all over the Mediterranean attacking people and winning. He's Viking in the Mediterranean. I mean, that's what he's doing. In 1044, he sought a share of Magnus the Good's kingdom of Denmark and Norway, and he raised an army and invaded Denmark in 1046. Magnus, at that point, agreed to share his kingdom, and he died in 1045, so that Harald Hardrada became king in 1047. His nephew, Svein Estrithson, seized Denmark, and years of warfare followed. Harald Hardrada is also called Ulfson, the son of Jarl Ulf and Canute. Svein Estrithson is also called Svein Ulfson because he's son of Jarl Ulf and Canute's sister Estrid. Note that he's named after his more important mother than he is after his less important father. So this indicates the importance of women in this society. Svein Estrithson was reared in Denmark, England, and Sweden, so he was in a very cosmopolitan Scandinavian world at that time. He had been regent of Denmark under Magnus, and he was a chief informant of Adam of Bremen, who wrote a lot of the history of this period. Harald Hardrada repeatedly ravaged Denmark, but he acknowledged Svein Estrithson as king in 1064. Meanwhile, in England, the death of Edward the Confessor led to Harold's last expedition against England, and it was Harald Hardrada who attacked while William the Conqueror was sitting with his fleet waiting for the winds to change for 8 months. And he was actually waiting for Harald Hardrada to go ahead and attack and weaken Harold Godwinson of England at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And that's where Harald Hardrada was killed, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. At this point, Harald Hardrada's claim to the English throne passed to Svein Estrithson. Canute Sveinsson, who is the son of Svein Estrithson, then invaded England with 240 ships in 1069. So even though William the Conqueror conquered England, he didn't win it in one battle. he had to fight off Vikings right and left, and he had to fight off the rebellious north. So the Battle of Hastings, I mean, he got him crowned king. He got the crown, but he didn't win the whole country. He had to defeat Canute Sveinsson in 1069. Svein Estridsson then joined Canute Sveinsson in 1070 on the Humber, and they made an agreement with William the Conqueror. At this point, Canute Sveinsson returned to England with a Danish-Norwegian fleet, but came back in 1075 and sacked York. 10 years later, Canute, now King of Denmark, planned to invade England again. That would have been in 1085. But in 1086, he was assassinated. Nevertheless, all of these relatives of King Canute continued to assert their claim on England, even though William the Conqueror had taken it. So William the Conqueror and Normandy are part of this whole Scandinavian world all this time. And so, by this time, by 1086, getting into the 1080s and the 1090s, by 1100, Scandinavia is not Viking anymore. I mean, it really is Christian, and it has the ideals, some of the ideals of Europe. Now let's trace Sweden quickly. Sweden goes back to about the same period. All the kings are in the early 800s that we can first identify, and there aren't any kings before that because there's no kingship. And we have a few kings who assert their power to the kingship. They're little local kings like Bjorn and Olaf and Eric the Victorious, but they're only kings out of little tiny local areas of Sweden. You don't have a real king of all Sweden until Olaf Skotkonung, and then you have a line. I should have actually I should have bold-faced all of these, because then you can trace these kings. Some of them are co-kings, but you can trace them, the line of kings, but we don't really know very much about them. So we can write a king list: Onund Jacob, Eamon the Old, Stenkel, Ragnvaldsson, Halstein, Hakon the Red, Inge the First, and Blotsven. Inge the First is restored. In this region of Sweden, Svir and Gottar had a close relationship, and both of those are regions of Sweden. Olaf Skotkonung is described in 975 as king of both Svir and Gottar, but they're not securely united until the 12th century. The Svir king also collected tribute from the Finnish areas east of the Baltic, and Olaf acknowledged Svein Forkbeard as his overlord. So even then, Sweden wasn't really independent. It just had little local kings. The history of Sweden during this time is not well known. We just have a bare bones knowledge of the fact. But Olaf Skotkonung Eriksson, a confederate of Svein Forkbeard and Jarl Erik Hakonarsson, against Olaf Tryggvason, had marriage ties with Denmark, and we know more about him. He obtained Ranriki Bohuslan and the territory in eastern Norway, and one of his daughters, this is one of Olaf Skotkonung's daughters, married Yaroslav the Wise again. And so you can see again how all of the Scandinavian people who are going to emerge as kings are all connected together, and they're friends of each other, and they are allied through marriage. Olaf Skotkonung is said to have accepted Christianity, but did not impose it on his people. He shared power with his son, who inherited, and this was Onund Jacob, who made an anti-Danish alliance with Olaf Haraldsson. That would be, of course, Saint Olaf. Saint Olaf was Olaf Haraldsson, which led to the sea fight at Helga, and he helped Olaf regain Norway. He also gave shelter to Svein Estridsson and Harald Hardrade, as did the kings of Russia, of Yaroslav the Wise and others. the Duchy of Normandy, which we've already looked at. We can track all of the, I think we have to look at the Duchy of Normandy almost like one of the kingdoms, because it's so important and because they end up being kings of England and having the Duchy of Normandy. So we can trace that line: Rolf the Ganger, William I Longsword, Richard I, Richard II, Richard III, Robert the Magnificent, William the Bastard, who is the best known. William the Bastard had 3 sons. Robert Curthose inherited Normandy. Henry I, William Rufus inherited England and later grabbed Normandy. Henry I, King of England, had both Normandy and England. Eventually, by 1106, he had Normandy as well as England. Then we have a civil war, and then the Angevins come to power: Henry II, Richard I, and John, King of England, and finally Normandy was lost to the French monarchy. But these are all kings of England after William the Bastard. The Kingdom of England is a Viking kingdom, of course, and we can sort of track it after we look at Alfred the Great. When Alfred's sons and grandsons restore it, Ethelstan is the most important, and then his brothers and sons inherit until we have Ethelred Unred, who is conquered by Canute, and then we have Canute's sons. Then finally Edward the Confessor, who is Ethelred's son, is restored. Harold Godwinson is a Danish pretender, and then we have William the Conqueror with the Kingdom of England. Then we have Norman kings, and here we pick up the same line that we had in Normandy: William Rufus, Henry I, Stephen. This is the Civil War, and then the Angevin kings. Meanwhile, we have a Norman kingdom going on in southern Italy and the Duchy of Apulia, which later becomes united with Sicily. And so we have another group of Normans down there: Robert Guiscard and Richard of Aversa, Roger Borsa, William, who is then king of, he's Duke of Apulia, and then during William's reign, Apulia is united with the Kingdom of Sicily. And then we have the Kingdom of Sicily, which you could argue, if you're going to argue that the Normans are really, very Viking, that here they are in Sicily as well. And so here are all the kings of Sicily, which eventually intermarry with the German monarchy. If you're interested in Sicily, I brought this wonderful book by Graham Loud, Robert Guiscard, The Age of Robert Guiscard, Southern Italy and the Norman Conquest. This is the other Norman conquest that people don't know anything about. The Normans actually conquered Italy and Sicily, as well as conquering England. So this is a wonderful book if you want to track down these Norman Vikings. So these are all the dynasties. Then we have to include, as one of these kingdoms coming together, the kings of Kiev and Novgorod, who we can trace from Rurik and Igor, Sviatoslav, Oleg, Yaropolk, Vladimir, Sviatopolk, and Yaroslav the Wise, who was the person I stopped with because I saw him as the high point of the Viking kings and the interaction, but here are his descendants, and so we have a line of Viking kings in Russia as well. Okay, so at that point we've got all of these Viking kingdoms coming together, and there are certainly a lot of them, aren't there? Maybe we'll look at our map a minute and we'll see all of the areas we've identified as Viking kingdoms. We've got Norway, Sweden, Denmark. England is a Viking kingdom. Norway, which is united with England. Russia, and not to mention Iceland. We didn't even mention Iceland, and Ireland comes together as a kingdom because of the Vikings. Scotland comes together as a kingdom because of the Vikings. Russia comes together as a kingdom because of the Vikings. We don't have the Norman Italy and Sicily on this map, but they come together too. So, what about the Viking legacy and the Vikings in history? Let's go through a very quick review, and then we'll consider some questions. We've looked at Viking origins and culture and society, arts and letters. We've looked at women, religion, sagas, and technology. That was in the first half of the course. And then we looked at initial invasions and the settlements in the Orkneys. Oh, I forgot to mention the Orkneys. Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, Greenland, Vinland, Russia, Normandy, and England. We've looked at conversion and Christianization and the formation of kingdoms. And so we started out our course looking at these wild Viking barbarian invaders, right? We looked at the myths of these fierce Vikings, or conversely at the myths of the mystic Knight of the Swan, the kind of Nibelungenlied mythology of Wagner's opera, and I think we dispelled a lot of that mythology of them being that way. And here are some real Vikings that we see on a chair in one of the churches later on, characteristically in battle, even on a church chair. So they retain their Viking character even after they're Christianized. And we looked at a lot of their artifacts. Here are some shield bosses, and here are some stirrups. And stirrups are interesting because they gained the stirrups. Once they had stirrups, they could ride horses, and a lot of them actually adopted the cavalry technology of the Normans later on. As we saw, here is another bit of their metalwork and their technology. Here is their wonderful capability in metalworking, and also their ability to acquire wealth in all of these beautiful rings, probably some of the loot that they got as they went a-Viking. And here is some more of the gold pins and jewelry that they had for themselves. Not to mention the fabulous metalwork that they did, this huge bowl with all of its beautiful pictures on it, and their weapons and their rune stones with runes. They had their own written language. We looked at that. We looked at the initial invasion of England, which goes all the way back to the end of the Roman Empire. The first Angles and the Saxons were sort of proto-Vikings, weren't they, when they first invaded England? We can trace that heritage all the way back. And everywhere the Vikings went, when they went a-Viking, they founded little towns and villages and trading posts. This is a modern little Viking village in Denmark. I just thought it was a nice picture. What I really took the picture for was this house is having a thatched roof put on it. They still have thatched roofs in Denmark, which is interesting. And they built trading networks all over the North Sea area. You can see all of these trading networks that spread out here and connect with all these land routes. So they're great traders and merchants, which is probably more important than their Viking, and was also part of their Viking. And the towns in the North Sea region, like this one of Lubeck, are due to that network of trade that they set up in the North Sea region. So here's the town of Lubeck. It's northern Germany on the North Sea. Interestingly, I forgot to print out a map of Russia. I was going to show Russia. Here it is. We can look at the foundation of Russia with its main Russian areas of Novgorod here and Kiev here, which are the Nexi, I guess you would call them, of the Kingdom of Russia that was finally done. And I just ran across today these incredible modern pictures modern renditions of the important kings. Here is an imaginary portrait of Rurik the Great, who, remember, he was the calling of the Varangians. The Slavs called him in to give them law and order. He was very generous. He gave it to him. And here is Vladimir. And what is Vladimir famous for? Remember Vladimir in Russia? He converted to Christianity. He's the one who converted to the Byzantine religion. So here is an imaginary picture of Vladimir. Notice that he's got a crown when Rurik didn't have a crown, so now he's a real king. And here is Yaroslav the Wise, who is the epitome of cultured Viking kingship, the Viking Christian king who married his children to all the crowned heads of Europe. And of course, Normandy is one of the most important foundations, because the Normans were very Viking. They went around and conquered everybody. Here is Rollo, or Rue, and the dynasty of the Norman dukes of Normandy. Here is a beautiful picture of the Channel Islands, which are kind of stepping stones to England. They're out in the middle of the channel. They're closer to Normandy than they are to England, but you get an idea of the lay of the land in the Channel Islands. And here is King William the Conqueror as he appears on his seal. You know, the other part of the seal shows him as riding a horse, and it is in a pose very much like this one. And you mentioned last time, remember we had this last time, that this looked very much like the picture on the bio tapestry of Harold of England going to fight or going to meet William the Conqueror in England, but this pose is so similar to the ones we see on all the seals, not only of the kings of England, but then it's adopted by the kings of France. This kind of picture of a warrior on horseback becomes common on the seals. And here is the Anglo-Norman state as William the Conqueror put it together so that it would be all of England plus Norway and Brittany and Maine. And so this was a kind of an Anglo-Norman realm that he put together. William the Conqueror introduced something new to England that we don't see in Scandinavia, and that is the castle. So the Normans learned this French culture, and they adopted especially the cavalry fighting on horseback and the building of castles. And then when they came to England, I told you that they tore down all the churches, the Anglo-Saxon churches, and they built Norman churches. They also built castles in every nook and cranny in England. This is the White Tower, the most famous of the Norman castles. And here are some imaginary pictures of what the kings looked like. William Rufus, who was considered a bad king, and Henry I, who was considered a good king. Okay, and here is one of the innovations of the Normans, who brought incredible law and order to England, and this is the Domesday Book, which is a survey of all the land holdings in England. They counted everything, every chicken, every pig, every plow, every peasant, everything on all the fish ponds. They counted everything in all the lands of England, and they listed it all down in Domesday Book. The sheriffs wrote it down. So this is a tribute to the bureaucratizing that was being done in England by the Normans, and also in the other Scandinavian countries at the same time. This is an interesting picture of Henry I. Actually, Henry I's son, Henry I was such an interesting king because he only had 2 children. And we've seen that lots of these kings had lots of children. But I think he very deliberately had only 1 child, a boy and a girl, and he stopped there because he didn't want his children to fall into civil war like he and his brothers had. But sadly, that one son was killed in a terrible shipwreck, the wreck of the White Ship in 1120, And here is a picture of the wreck of the White Ship, and if you can see that on the screen, doesn't it look like a Viking ship? In the harbor of northern Normandy is where the ship hit a rock and sunk, and here is the White Ship sinking, and it looks very Viking from a manuscript of the time, 12th century really. Another thing that we find in England that is extraordinary is map making, maps of the world, which I think really comes from Viking culture. This is the Hereford map. It is made about 1110, and so it's got to be very Viking in origin, the drawing of these maps. It has to be because these Vikings are traveling all over the world, that the Normans then are impelled to draw maps. We also see the building of churches all over Normandy and abbeys. This is a plan of Fountains Abbey that was built at this time in England. Also, we see the rise of towns everywhere in Europe. We see the Vikings spurring a building of towns. This is the town hall of Louvain in Belgium, which would have been in Frisia. And here is the reception of a doctor, the rise of universities, which also follows shortly after the Viking invasions. And here then is the building boom, and this is an example of the kind of building that is much later in England, actually, this very fancy building, metalwork of this kind. This is showing the city of the Temple of Jerusalem, the burgeoning of art in the 12th century Renaissance that follows the Viking Age. Here is the minting of money and the treasury and the growth of wealth in Europe that follows the Viking Age. And the rise of courtly love, as we can see. This is definitely not a Viking ship in this assault on the Castle of Love. And here's a fortified bridge that would have been built all over Europe to keep out the Vikings. And finally, I have this picture of the Crusade as a sort of last suggestion that so many of the men of Northern Europe from Frisia and Flanders and Normandy and England went on the First Crusade, that one wonders if maybe it wasn't the conquest of England that was the last crusade, but maybe the first crusade, the last Viking attack, but maybe the crusade had something of Viking, something to do with Vikings in it. Okay, so we've done a quick overview of our course. What then was the Viking legacy? How do the Vikings fit into European history? And now maybe we might have a little bit of discussion. I have here most of these questions that I have here are the questions I want you to consider, because we're going to choose some of them for your final exam. Okay, so your final exam will be chosen essentially from these questions. So you might want to discuss. They're already posted on our website, so you can find them in a separate document as well as this document on the website. Western Civ texts, even some medieval history texts, ignore Vikings or treat them as barbarians who disappear quickly. Did the Vikings make any contributions to Europe? Were they a stimulus of some kind? Did they make any concrete contributions? What do you all think? Any ideas on Viking contributions to Europe? Or, I mean, what do you think?
Well, I mean, they minted money, and I know that they did it for the first time ever in Ireland. They were the reason that Ireland became somewhat of a trading post for the rest of Europe.
Or a kingdom. Okay, so that was an impact they had on Europe. I mean, why do you think the textbooks don't mention them very much? I mean, think that they were just nothing. I mean, do you think that's right? Would you agree with that?
I come in a lot of, I guess, do you think that a lot of people's perception of Viking history was dated by Nazi Germany?
Was that they were what?
That a lot of the Viking or Norse culture, ancient cultures, a lot of them perceive it to be used like with propaganda used by Nazi Germany, that now in modern times people like scare away from it, kind of like are afraid of learning about it because they associate it with something not very good.
Yeah, maybe the theories of Nazi Germany that they could associate it with, but you know, historians aren't supposed to do that. They're supposed to be very neutral. They're not supposed to take ideological stands on anything. I mean, you know, a true historian just looks at the facts and said, what happened? That's what historians are supposed to do. They're not supposed to say if it's good or bad. What do you think?
I think one of the problems was that they didn't have a way to record their history themselves very, as well as like the monks and the people that they were actually attacking. So they got I think a bad rap due to the fact that everybody did that. And then their history didn't really get recorded for centuries until the sagas, 3 or 4 centuries after the Viking Age.
So yeah, but you know, a lot of the textbooks sort of say, well, they came and attacked, yes, and they scared everybody, and they killed a lot of people, and then they disappeared. Do you agree with that? I mean, what happened to them? I mean, what happened to them? Did they disappear? There are no Vikings anymore after we have the conversion of the Scandinavian states. So what happened to these Vikings?
Assimilated into each other, I guess into different cultures that they settled into and conquered. They became also the very essence of Norman conquest as well, and the whole trading and going to different countries and different people and learning languages. I mean,
well, are you saying they were so successful that they disappeared? And so, I mean, on the surface, it appears like they disappear. I mean, that's what it really looks like if you just look at the surface. You think they had any impact on Europe? You think they changed Europe in any way? How did they change Europe?
Well, they changed the warfare. I mean, for one,
they did.
They brought horses. They brought the broadswords and the chainmail. And
well, people had that already, though. They had horses, broadswords, and chainmail. The Vikings had them as well as the people of Europe had them.
I'm doing my paper on Ireland, and so they brought all of this stuff to Ireland.
They brought it all to Ireland. That's absolutely true. They did bring it to Ireland. Yeah. They probably stimulated a lot of warlike mentality in Europe. Don't you think they did? Because people had to defend themselves, and so they probably reinforced the warrior mentality in Europe that was already there, but Christianity was softening. And so the Vikings might have sharpened that warrior mentality in Europe, which might have been why the First Crusade took off the way it did. So, I mean, you have to look at what they stimulated as well. Do you think of any other things the Vikings actually stimulated in Europe? Or any concrete things they contributed? As far as Ireland is concerned, they stimulated state building. They certainly stimulated state building in Ireland. Do you think they did any place else? Can you think of any place else?
Did they have as profound an effect on everybody else's seagoing and just their ships were revolutionary. I mean, did that...
They were.
Did that go as far as Europe and everything else?
No. You know, that's very strange. The Europeans ignored that shipbuilding technology. I mean, when they got to the Mediterranean, they didn't carry it into the Mediterranean. They used the Mediterranean. They used Greek ships in the Mediterranean. And even the Normans who went to Italy eventually dropped their Viking ships and they adopted the Greek ships that were in the Mediterranean. They were inferior to the Viking ships, but they were adequate for the Mediterranean. The Viking ships were better on the North Atlantic. And Europe did not adopt that ship technology. Isn't that interesting? They did adopt the heavy plow. The heavy plow was an important impact on Europe. It allowed them to clear the lands of northern Europe and farm the lands which they couldn't farm before without the heavy plow. Well, that kind of answers, well, no, that doesn't answer the next question. So we've see if you can think of some other contributions the Vikings might have made to Europe, in case this question is on your exam. How about the European culture? Did it change the Vikings any? Did the European culture change the Vikings? How did it change the Vikings? Think of some ways it changed the Vikings?
Religion.
Yeah, made them Christian.
And then because of that, they stopped their Viking ways.
And they stopped their Viking. It sort of tamed them a little bit, sort of. But then they wanted to be Christian kings, and so they used their warlike abilities that way. Yeah. Think for a bit about Iceland and how rural and backward Iceland was. You know, we talked about would Iceland have been what the Scandinavians would have been naturally if they hadn't had the European stimulus. And the Icelanders were quite isolated and rather backward rural people, whereas the Danes are very cosmopolitan and more like the Europeans and stimulated by European learning and culture, and so that if you think about that contrast, then you can see some of the stimulus that Europe gave the Vikings. It gave them writing, and maybe sharpened their ability to use their law codes and their sagas, their wonderful literature and poetry. They were able to write down and maybe Europeanize. Maybe this is an obvious question. Why do you think the Vikings converted to Christianity? What do you think?
Well, we already said because their kings converted so that they would have more of they could have the divine right, and they couldn't be deposed or anything by the people.
But the people eventually converted too. I mean, the kings kind of forced the people to convert. Why do you think the people consented? I mean, the people rebelled at first, but eventually they did convert. Any? Can you think of any reasons why they might have?
They're tired of being tortured.
Yeah. Could be they were tired of being tortured and attacked.
There was some of the similarities between the two religions made it not quite so far-fetched or so big of a change for them.
Yeah, there are certain parallels. Can you think of any particular parallels in the religion?
Baptism and the naming ceremony.
And the naming ceremony and baptism.
I forget what the god's name is that was killed, but he was going to come back again.
Balder the Good. Balder the Good was the god who was resurrected when he came back after it's not Armageddon, it's Ragnarok. And Armageddon and Ragnarok is another parallel that we could raise. So there are interesting parallels with the Viking religion. Also, remember that the Viking religion was not very well organized and not very central and not very standard, and Christianity had this strong organization to it that the Viking religion didn't have. It was almost irresistible in a lot of ways because it was so strong. And also, the Viking religion didn't have any priests, and they didn't really have, a bureaucracy promoting the religion like Christianity did. So, which would have made Christianity stronger than the Viking. Anything else about the Viking religion that you think might have, helped people convert to Christianity? Anything else you can think of? What do you think was the impact of polytheism? If you have a polytheistic religion and a monotheistic religion, what would be the tendencies going on there? Any ideas?
The monastic religion would be more, everyone could kind of unite around that one, as opposed to everybody being divided, some worshiping these gods and others worshiping other gods.
Yeah, so that the monotheistic religion would tend to be more unified, and whereas the Viking religion was more scattered. Do you have an idea too?
I was just going to say, a lot of the stuff that I read indicated that purely conceptually, the Christian God was obviously the bigger dog, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, had domain over all things, and it was easy to argue. It's like, well, you've got this God, but we got a big fat God. You know?
Right, we've got a really powerful God, and all your gods are scattered. And any other thing about polytheism that would tend to make people accept Christianity? Or how about not accept Christianity so much as let that Christian God get a foot in the door, which is what they often did. What do you think?
Well, at first he would have just joined the pantheon of the Christian God would have just joined the pantheon of their gods, and then they could kind of slide out the other gods.
Yeah, well they would if they're polytheistic, they would tend to accept the Christian God as just another God in their pantheon. I mean, you know, if you have lots of God, what's one more? But this was a really powerful God who ended up taking over everything. At least had a powerful priesthood who pushed him.
I liked all those pictures of Jesus with giant swords. That was pretty funny.
Yes, pictures of Jesus with giant swords, and you know, that sort of fits in with that crusading mentality that I was suggesting at the end, that maybe the Vikings had something to do with the rise of the crusading mentality in Europe. Well, let's see if we have some more questions here that might be on the exam. Okay. Was Iceland a kind of pure Viking society, the path that the Scandinavians would have taken if they had not been influenced by Europe? I kind of argued that when I talked about Iceland. Or was Iceland the consequence of the frontier experience, as Jesse Byock argued? I gave you Jesse's ideas on that. We had a little discussion on that later. If you thought any more about that, an answer to that kind of question. What do you think?
I think that it's difficult to say that because Iceland was so isolated. If Sweden and Norway hadn't been influenced by Europe, they still would have been out a Viking, where Iceland was so far away that it was rather inconvenient and hard for them to do that.
So you like Jesse's theory, essentially, that maybe it was a frontier society, and so the isolation, the position it was in. So certainly that is an argument that can be made. Everybody want to go along with that, or any other ideas? What do you think?
I disagree. I did my paper over Icelandic law, and a lot of the feuding that went on in Iceland, I feel, was based off of kind of the Viking tradition of I guess, inter-family fighting and definition of feuding. But therefore, since the legal, I guess, strata of Iceland was made off of the old Viking ways of acting and interacting with different families, I think that Iceland actually was a more Viking country in its own.
Well, that's pretty interesting. So you like the idea that all these Viking warriors turned into lawyers who fought. Sort of, yeah, to oversimplify the matter. But the family feuding, yeah, which is really intrinsic to the original Viking society, all of that family feuding between the different families. Yeah, one could argue that. But you all need to think about that and sort of rethink Iceland and what you think about that. Well, what is the significance of Iceland as the first European democracy? First of all, do you agree it was a democracy?
when we brought this up the first time, I had kind of a problem because you had Greece and Rome, which were democracies long before Iceland.
Okay, yeah, okay, but you didn't. But Europe didn't exist when you had Greece and Rome. I mean, Italy and Greece existed. Yeah, okay, that would be. But everybody, all the historians say Iceland was the first European democracy. It's kind of hard to argue that Iceland was part of Europe. I mean, in a way, I would kind of quibble with that in a way. But you can't. You have to agree that these democratic principles are a real part of the early Scandinavian society. What do you think?
I'm not exactly sure of this, but just in my readings, it seemed like the things that were made up in Iceland were more based on democratic principles, that it was more the people's thing versus what I gathered of the things in, say, Sweden or Norway or Denmark. They had kind of a legislative body that it was always the same people.
Yes, it was more aristocratic. It was almost more of a republic kind of thing in Scandinavia. And so you had a different kind of evolution in Iceland, is what I'm hearing you say. Would that be right, that it was more evolving down to the people in Iceland, which is a really interesting concept to look at how that government developed. So would you, maybe Iceland isn't significant at all to Europe because it was so isolated nobody in Europe knew that Iceland had a democracy. Which is one thing you could absolutely argue. I mean, who went to Iceland? The Norwegians did, but they cared more about Europe than they did about Iceland. Okay, let's see if we have a couple more questions here. Is it right to see England as primarily Anglo-Saxon, as some do? Did the Vikings change it or otherwise affect it? Or what about Canute and his empire and the Normans? What do we do with England? I mean, England is quite a puzzle here. Of course, the English like to look at it as Anglo-Saxon and utterly English. And here we've got all these Vikings and Normans traipsing around in England. What do you think? Well, what would you venture to argue about England if you had to write an essay on England? Well, what would you kind of say about it? Yeah.
I'd say, I mean, the Normans are so Viking-like that it's tough to separate those two. And between Canute and the Normans, there's centuries and centuries of control by Vikings.
It goes all the way back to Alfred the Great. All those Vikings are there.
But to say that England is primarily Anglo-Saxon would just be wishful thinking as far as the Anglo-Saxons go. It's inevitable that it's not pure in that way of thinking.
England is not pure. No, it's got lots of invaders and lots of settlers that are Viking, and so it's kind of a misnomer to say. But I think those who argue that it's really Anglo-Saxon would say Alfred the Great and his sons and grandsons reconquered it and reimposed Anglo-Saxon culture on them. And so that would be the counter argument that Alfred and his sons and grandsons restored that basic Anglo-Saxon culture by Christianizing them too. Anglo-Saxons are Christians. Vikings are not. Any other theories you might argue about England? You need to think about some theories to argue about England. How about the theory that England is the melting pot of the Scandinavian world? One could argue that. And that would be a real revolutionary thing to argue. The Anglo-Saxon Sir Frank Stenton might turn over in his grave. But clearly it's a big player in the Scandinavian world. Well, how about the concept of a clash of cultures? Is this a good way to view the Vikings in Europe, or will some other theory work better? A clash of cultures. Was there a clash of cultures? Yeah.
Years ago, I'd always heard that England was really influenced by the Romans with Hadrian and all that. But I guess when the Anglo-Saxons came in, they kind of wiped that away and started anew with a new culture. Is that?
Yeah, that is a lot of what's argued. There's a new book out by Michael. Now I can't remember his last name. Darn. Anyway, I can see his face and I can't remember his last name. But he argued that the Romans had utterly no impact on England. They built a few ruins, and since the Britons left England and they were the ones who were Romanized, that the Romans really had very little impact on England. So, but everybody doesn't agree. That's rather a revolutionary theory. But the Angles and the Saxons didn't entirely displace the Britons, but they intermarried with them, and they brought a more predominant Anglo-Saxon culture that overwhelmed whatever British culture was there, whatever Roman culture was there. I mean, England had to be reconverted. It reverted to paganism, and so. What about the concept of a clash of cultures? Does that, I mean, that's a sort of, trendy way of looking at civilizations coming together. Does it work with the Vikings?
I think it did until they started having religious wars and battles, and they started bringing religion into it, and then it kind of, because before the Vikings would go to different civilizations, different societies, and it'll be okay. They didn't want to dominate their pagan religion and anybody else. But as soon as it started, they're trying to conquer each other, then it just kind of, it was a big clash, because it was either one was going to be overwhelmed by the other no matter what. And it was Christianity because it was the big.
And that's a really important concept you brought up, that the Vikings were not out to overwhelm people with their culture. All they wanted was to get rich. All they wanted was to loot and raid and trade. And it was the Christians who really crushed them, didn't they? I mean, really overwhelmed their culture. Except, even in Iceland. I mean, Iceland converted. So in a sense, if it was a clash of cultures, all the luck was on the side of the Christians, to use a Viking term. I mean, the Vikings never had a chance, did they, with the missionary spirit of the Normans? That's an interesting way to look at it. Okay, Soviet historians claim that the Viking foundation of Russia was legendary, that the Slavs originated Russian culture. Swedish historians see the Svir and Gotar Rus as almost single-handedly inventing Russia. So how do we describe the foundation of the Russian state? What do you think about those theories? You have to go back to our outline of Russian history and think about what the Rus did as they went in there and organized the Slavs. Did the Slavs really call them in as Varangians, call them in there to bring them law and order? Once again, just as in England, the Rus were overwhelmed by the Slavic culture. It's almost as if the Vikings kind of blend in, wherever they go, they just blend in, don't they? They do it in England, they do it in Scandinavia, they do it in Russia, they do it in Normandy. interesting quality that the Vikings have of assimilating, which might be why they kind of disappear.
It kind of speaks to how it wasn't really a clash of cultures, because
Okay.
they weren't interested in even their culture. They just wanted to get rich or be settled and content wherever they were, and then they would adopt whatever culture was around, and that's probably why they disappeared.
But doesn't that make them really successful, though, because they got what they wanted, and in some cases they ended up, in control? So then the question is, did they leave any mark at all on any of these cultures? They were eminently practical. They were so practical. They just, did what it took to get along, didn't they? It's really funny. How about Normandy? English scholars in particular see it as swiftly unique and losing its Viking heritage, adopting French feudalism, adopting Christianity swiftly. How different were the Normans from their Viking ancestors? Was the Norman conquest, as Wolfgang Grape argues, the last Viking conquest? Well, like Russia, they assimilated really quickly, at least on the surface. But then we have 1066 and the last great Viking raid. So what do we think of that?
They were Normans. I mean, they Christianized, but they remained a lot. They had a lot of Viking left in them, even after they Christianized, and they were still fighting and conquering, like in 1066 with William the Conqueror. But they remained Viking, I think, more than the Russians or anyone else.
It kind of makes me want to grab that picture of Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, fighting in the Battle of Hastings with his club. I mean, that was a Christian adaptation to Norman values. So the Normans kind of do that as well. I mean, it's a blend. Okay, well then we come down to our very last question in our last 5 minutes. What does it mean for England that it suffered or enjoyed perhaps 3 Viking conquests? The Great Army in Alfred's time, the Danelaw settlements, Svein Forkbeard and Canute's conquest, and William the Conqueror's conquest. Maybe we kind of answered that already, that it was assimilated into the Viking world. Okay, maybe there's one more question. Let's see if there's one more question. Can we say that there was some kind of Viking achievement, and what might it have been? What do you think there's?
I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, but I think it's great that, I mean, they did achieve so much in I guess, England, for instance, but yet they're still not known for any of their legal achievements, for their ruling achievements. They're only known for being conquerors and going into a place. I mean, they must have had one hell of a force to go in and take over people if that's all they're known for, is their ability to swoop in and kill a bunch of people and steal their stuff.
But you're saying, now I'm not looking for, okay, to answer your first question, I'm looking for your ideas, not something I have in my mind. But you're raising a very important point, and the point is that law is one of their great achievements. And don't you see law and legal consciousness appearing in all of these societies that they're involved in? I mean, you especially see it in England, the common law, the development of common law. Yeah, and you see law in Russia. You certainly see it in Iceland. You see it in Scandinavia. That would be one of their achievements. And plus, killing and looting and conquering places, that was one of their achievements. Any other achievements you can think of? You see the Vikings achieving anything else? I mean,
Great literature, eventually, with all the sagas and
yeah.
oral traditions.
The oral traditions, the wonderful poetry they wrote, which is very vivid, and I mean, it's hard to understand unless you read a lot of it, but, and certainly the sagas, they're a great achievement. How about state building? You know, everywhere they went, the result was state building. And the Vikings sort of entered into that. I mean, they intermarried, or they conquered, or they took control of those various areas, and then you have the building of states where there weren't any before. Certainly that would be a large achievement of the Vikings. Any others you can think of?
They discovered Iceland and Greenland, right?
Right, they were wonderful explorers. Yes, they paved the way for Christopher Columbus, because Christopher Columbus went to Norway to study navigation. He knew the New World was out there. Well, he used to be extolled as a great discoverer, but the Vikings were there first. Okay. Well, I think we've said a lot of Viking achievements, and we've reviewed most of the questions that are going to be on your study sheet, that are already on your study sheet on the website, so go look at that. There's one more question that'll be on the Viking personality, which will be a fun one for you to develop. What was the Viking personality, and where did it come from? Okay. Well, that ends our course, and I've really enjoyed sharing my knowledge of the Vikings with you, and I hope you've had fun learning about the Vikings. So we'll see you all at the final exam.